Hello everyone and welcome back to another Kerbal Space Program video, and in today's Kerbal Space Program video I decided to make a base for the people. Surface bases in Kerbal Space Program can be somewhat challenging to build because they often necessitate more than one launch, and they take a bit of tinkering around with reassembly in low Kerbin orbit, or indeed in the orbit of wherever it is you plan to send the surface base. Assembly or driving different modules together, it's a bit of a faff. So I thought, let's try and make a universal surface base that can land on any planet or moon of your choosing and is ready to go. It does not need reconfiguration or reassembly or just, I guess, regular assembly either. It's all in one, it's nicely packaged, but it's not going to be compromised at all. It will still have all the bells and whistles that you could desire from a surface base. It's got crew storage, it's got storage, and it's got crew capacity. It's got a rover garage with a closing door. It's got a drill and a refinery and an ore tank. It's got ample electric supply, and it's got every single science unit in stock KSP. So that was my, thesis for this base. I actually made a post on Twitter, you can follow me using the link in the description by the way, asking people, what needs to be on a surface base, and I had some good suggestions that I didn't think of initially. One person, I really should have wrote these names down, shouldn't I? I'm really sorry, I don't remember who said what, but someone suggested the rover garage, which I already talked about. Someone also suggested that we should have a rotating antenna, so we're going to have a rotating antenna, guys. Someone also suggested outdoor seating area, that's there as well. I am just speaking off the top of my head, just based on what I remember from the replies to this status. I'm very sorry, I really should have got into this commentary with something prepared, but whatever, guys. I guess I'm just excited because, you can download this craft from the description and you can land it wherever you want. Now, there is a caveat. Obviously, a landing module that's designed to land somewhere like Eve needs to be dramatically different to somewhere that needs to land on, say, Tylo. So this craft comes in several different configurations. The one you're seeing in this video, it's funny, I was going to surprise where we're going to land this base in this video, but I'm now aware that I probably put that in the title or the thumbnail or probably both. So it's not really a spoiler. We're going to be landing this surface base on Tylo. The reason being that Tylo is the hardest body to land stuff on in Kerbal Space Program, so I feel like that's going to be the best test of this surface base's capability of landing places. But yes, it can land on somewhere like Tylo, which obviously needs a very, very powerful landing stage. It needs a lot of fuel in the landing stage, which means it's going to need a very heavy lift launch vehicle. Contrast that to somewhere like Eve, which doesn't really need a very big craft because Eve is fairly close to Kerbin, and Eve has a very thick atmosphere, so all of the landing procedure can be done basically using parachutes. So to land on Eve doesn't require anywhere near as much power as it would to land this on Tylo. So this actually comes in several different configurations. This is the Tylo configuration, which is the biggest of the bunch. We also have a distant moon configuration for places like, I know Elu is a planet, but Elu, Bop, Pol, that sort of things. Places that don't necessitate the massive amount of Delta V required for Tylo, but still require quite a lot of Delta V in the transfer stage to reach. We also have a nearby moon configuration if you wanted to take this to somewhere like the Mun, Gili, Minmus, that sort of thing. I have no idea if this could even land on Gili, to be fair, so that's probably not the best example. And then we have a dedicated Eve configuration, just because to land on Eve requires lots of heat shields that you don't really need anywhere else, not even places like Lathe. So I felt like an Eve configuration would need to be its own thing. Now, this is where the community must step in, because actually I've only tested this on Tylo. On paper, all the other configurations should work as advertised, and I did quickly check the Eve descent module, works and will survive atmospheric entry, but I don't know for sure. So rather than there being a conventional craft file download link, there's actually going to be a link to a forum post that I have made. And the idea is that, we as a community can figure out if we can put my money where my mouth is, and this can actually land on every single body in Kerbal Space Program. So Tylo has been validated, but in the description, click that link, go to the forum post, and try this craft file out for yourself. But make sure that if you do try it out, document your process, and then you can reply to the forum thread, hey, I have just managed to successfully land this on Ike or Juna, etc. And together we can validate this craft as a team, as one unit, because I'm far too lazy to do it all myself, to be honest, guys. A couple of things to note. The one place I am not sure it would be the easiest place to visit with this base would be Moho, just because of the immense amount of Delta V to go to Moho. Now, you can do it with gravity assists and stuff like that, but I wanted to try and make it easy, and so I would like to be able to visit Moho without needing to bother doing gravity assists or anything. So one thing you may need to do if you're planning on a Moho landing with this thing is to add a second stage to the fuel tank, which you can see me adding here. This is the nuclear transfer stage. At the bottom is a docking port so that you can dock a second fuel reserve to this thing to give it more Delta V to reach somewhere like Moho that requires a lot of Delta V. I'm pretty sure Moho is the only place that you can't really get to in one launch. So there's the caveat. But hey, again, reply to the forum post. If you're able to go to Moho without needing to add more fuel using a second launch, let me know. I would very much appreciate it. And hey, if you do manage to get to Moho by launching a second craft and adding another fuel tank to that interplanetary transfer stage, let me, again, leave a picture or a craft file or something in the thread so we can add it to the Universal Surface Space Project. Is what I'm calling it. That's what I just thought of on the spot right now. Now, at the time of me recording this segment that you're currently watching, I wasn't sure where I would land it in this video to showcase the base, so I put it on Twitter. Guys, I have created a Universal Surface Base in KSP. Where should I land it? And I waited like 2 hours for people to post their replies, and then I did a tally of the votes for each celestial body. So let's do that and pretend that we don't already know the result. Let's go. And we are off, ladies and gentlemen. The votes are flying in. Tylo takes an early lead, but we've got some votes for Moho, Eve, Ike, Drez, Val, Paul, and Tylo has received some more votes. Tylo is storming into the lead, but what's this? Moho, Drez, and Paul. Oh my goodness, but Moho is storming ahead. Not quite catching up to Tylo, but it's definitely getting there. Oh, and Paul is getting an unusual amount of votes. And Drez, out of nowhere, my goodness. It's done. Moho's overtaken Tylo. This is very exciting, guys. But Tylo's edged it once again. And, Moho's got another vote. And Drez has got more votes than I thought it would, actually. And Eve's got a lot of votes as well. But there we are. That's how it all went. So, yeah, Moho got a surprising amount of votes there. So, clearly, in the future, I should probably do a Moho surface base because I guess there was a lot of love for it on the old Twitter poll. Let me know if you think that would be a good idea. That wasn't very good, was it? Anyway, as you can see, our launch is well underway, and you may have noticed a couple of things about the rocket. It's like a sort of jumbo SLS looking thing, first of all, with those two massive SRBs on the side of the main core. But you may have noticed that the Kerbals are sitting in the Apollo-style command pod right at the top of the stack, and that's just because it's for the people, this base. It's for anyone and everyone, and you might be playing in a save file that doesn't have reverting flights enabled. So if anything catastrophic were to fail, in the likely event of disaster, it would be nice to have some means of getting the Kerbals free without just, dying, basically. So they all sit in the top of the stack, and if the whole thing needs aborting, you can press the abort action group and the fairings will deploy, the launch escape system will fire, and the command pod will pull away and obviously deploy its parachutes nice and safely. Once we're in orbit and all that and stabilized, we'll then transfer the Kerbals down into the surface base itself for their journey to wherever it is they're journeying to. In this case, it's going to be Tylo. So that's why that is there. The fairings have now gone, but I tried to make the fairings look a little bit realistic. Like, it'd be very tempting to make a really sprawling base and have this ridiculous, oversized, massive inflated fairing at the top of a very spindly looking rocket in comparison. So I tried to make the fairing only slightly wider than the main stack. Basically, make it look proportional and make it look like something that might exist in real life. Now here I am setting the nuclear engines to be toggled by an action group just because I didn't check my staging properly. Sorry, Scott. And I couldn't really get the nuclear engines to fire without one of the decouplers firing first. And no matter how much I changed the staging window on the left and reconfigured everything, one of the decouplers would always fire first, no matter what I did. So I had to just resort to binding the nuclear engines to an action group in order to activate them safely. So that's what I was doing there. That was a very long-winded explanation. Now we can plot a maneuver node to get ourselves to Joule. And like I said, I wanted to try and make this surface base as user-friendly and easy as possible. So we're not going to be doing any gravity assists whatsoever, not just to get to Joule, but also to circularize around Tylo. We're not going to do a Tylo gravity assist to first capture around Joule. This thing has the Delta V. It also has only the one stage for the interplanetary transfer stage. So we're not going to be dropping any fuel tanks in deep space, letting them float around, contribute to Kessler syndrome, all that good stuff. Again, to cater for everyone's needs, especially my own. I hate dumping fuel tanks without any means of those fuel tanks getting deorbited or getting destroyed in some way. So that's kind of why this is one giant monolithic stage. I know I could have made it much smaller and much more, I don't know, economical in terms of its size and cost if I had staging tanks, but just makes it a bit easier having the single stage, and again, means that we don't have to drop any fuel tanks that will get left in space, basically. Now, as you can see, I have time warped up to apoapsis and have dropped our periapsis to intersect Kerbin's atmosphere. The reason being that we need to get rid of that command pod at the top and the launch escape system. Before we can do that, we're going to transfer the Kerbals, as you may have noticed, into the surface space below, and once they're safe and sound, we can deploy the launch escape system, which means that that is going to just deorbit and get destroyed. It's not going to get left stuck floating around in space, just like I described when talking about not wanting to dump fuel tanks in deep space. So there goes, I think this is our last Kerbal to transfer now. Yep, our pilot Kerbal just there. She's going to man the cupola module, because that is the command pod of the surface base, I suppose. And there goes the launch escape system and launch escape capsule. So now we can quickly raise our periapsis again so that we don't enter Kerbin's atmosphere along with the launch escape module, and then we can time warp down to execute our maneuver node, which actually I need to replot because now it's moved because we were playing around with our periapsis height. So yes, I did multiple burns at Kerbin periapsis just because although this craft has the Delta V to do a nice easy trip to Joule with no need for gravity assists, it nonetheless still has quite poor thrust to weight ratio, so it's better to do more than one burn at Kerbin periapsis. Doing 2 burns that are around 450 meters per second in terms of Delta V to get all the way to the edge of Kerbin's sphere of influence, and then one final bigger burn to get all the way to Joule. And I got my Joule encounter fairly easily, and that's because I launched this craft at an optimal Joule transfer window, which would be if you were to draw a line from Kerbin to the Sun to Joule, Joule being ahead of Kerbin in this scenario, the angle that that line would form at the Sun would be about 100 degrees. I just tend to eyeball it in the tracking station, but you can use an online tool like Transfer Window Planner if you want to be all precise for some reason, but I find eyeballing just works fine, especially for Joule because it has such a massive gravity well that it's really quite trivial to get an encounter with. I don't think I even set it as my target when plotting the maneuver node to get there, which shows how simple it is to get an encounter with Joule. So obviously we are now well on our way to Joule, but we need to do a mid-course correction burn because Joule's orbit is slightly tilted compared to Kerbin's orbit, so you often need to do a normal or anti-normal burn along the way to make sure that your plane as you pass by Joule is along the same line as the moons of Joule, which obviously in this case we want that to be the case because we want to enter an orbit around one of its moons, namely Tylo, which you can see I'm just plotting an encounter with now. There's not really much to it, just play around with the maneuver node maker and you'll kind of get a feel for how to force the Tylo encounter. Watch those grey separation indicators. Once you've got the inclination around Joule correct using the purple ones, the triangles, the normal and anti-normal nodes, then just play around with the turquoise and yellow ones, prograde, retrograde, radial in, radial out, and you can just gradually force those grey indicators together. I could go into the specifics, but I feel like if you just try it out, you'll get a knack and get a feel for kind of how each of those inputs affects the separation indicators, and that's probably the easiest way to learn it. Just practice, basically. Wild concepts on this channel, right? Practice and you'll get better at something, but I think that's the best way. Just go ahead and try it and you'll get a feel for it, I'm sure. I believe in you. Trust me, guys. Anyway, my original plan for this mission was to perform a gravity assist using Tylo to capture into a stable Joule orbit, and then get a second Tylo encounter where the Delta V to circularize would be lower. However, I plotted a little draft maneuver node at Tylo periapsis based on the encounter that we have, and we've actually got enough Delta V to not only circularize at Tylo, but basically lower our apoapsis down to be in low Tylo orbit. So I thought, well, let's just save ourselves a job here, guys, and do it all in one go. Now, unfortunately, we don't have quite enough Delta V in that nuclear transfer stage to deorbit the nuclear transfer stage. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to just start our landing burn using those top Wolfhound engines with the nuclear stage still attached. And then as soon as our periapsis enters the negative figures, as in it intersects Tylo's surface, then we'll just drop those nuclear engines. Because we do have more delta V than we need in that top stage for a Tylo landing. I think it's got just shy of 3,000 meters per second. And for a Tylo landing, you really only need about 2,400 to do it easily. I like having the extra amount of delta V, just in case you come down to land and realize you're landing on a massive slope and need to make a last minute adjustment. And, you know, just to give ourselves a bit more wiggle room when it comes to getting a nice controlled descent. It's nice to not have the bare minimum delta V that you need. It's always nice to have a little bit of a buffer. Anyway, speaking of our landing, let's do that now. So again, landing on Tylo is pretty tough because you can't use parachutes, and for all intents and purposes, I know there's a slight disparity, but for all intents and purposes, Tylo is the same as Kerbin in terms of delta V. Except unlike Kerbin, again, you can't use the atmosphere or parachutes to slow yourself down. So I'm not going to speed the footage up too much for the descent, just so you can get an appreciation of how I did it. Whilst we are descending and not much else is happening, by the way, I do want to quickly touch on something I didn't cover at the time, and that was our circularization around Tylo. I did multiple burns at Tylo periapsis to get our orbit into a low Tylo orbit rather than an eccentric Tylo orbit, just because it's a bit more efficient to do retrograde burns at periapsis compared to other places in your orbit. And I was aware that the delta V budget was a bit tight, so I thought let's just try and make things efficient and do multiple burns at Tylo periapsis. Obviously doing lots of little burns rather than one giant burn means that you're spending proportionally more time at Tylo periapsis compared to just doing one giant burn, where you're going to be doing a lot of burning either side of periapsis. So here we are approaching the surface of Tylo. It looms before us, and it's a pretty flat spot, like it's on a slight hill, but we can make some adjustments to our landing legs to level the base once we're touched down. Right before we touch the surface, I'm going to hit spacebar to detach that upper stage and let it fly away safely, so it's not just on the ground next to our base, or indeed stuck to the top of our base like some sort of weird pat. There it goes. That's going to smash into the surface very, very fast and get destroyed. And hey, look at that. Isn't that cool? I've actually got a seismic scanner experiment at my other Tylo surface base on the other side of the moon, and that detected seismic activity when the retro rocket stage smacked into the surface. So isn't that a cool feature? Like, I knew the seismic scanner experiments were sensitive to things like a Kerbal falling on the surface or things happening in close proximity to the experiment, but I didn't realize that it worked for such a long distance. There you are. Isn't that cool? You may have just noticed me awkwardly sliding the surface base down the hill a bit, just so I could get the rover ramp to be up the hill, just so the rover has to go up as little of an incline change as possible. And now what we're doing is I'm just removing each of the landing legs from the symmetry and manually adjusting the spring and damper strength to kind of force the base into a flatter orientation so that it's all leveled and it's not at a slant that the ground it is sitting on is. And I think I did a pretty good job, actually. You do have to be careful, though, because if you make adjustments to the spring strength or the damper strength very quickly, then it just causes the whole thing to pogo stick. Or, you know, I had an instance where the landing leg that I adjusted the spring strength for tipped the entire base over and it did a somersault and exploded. So don't do that. My recommendation would be to just make a quick save before you start messing with the landing legs. If you're playing on a save file without quick saves, then just take it slow and you'll probably be fine. Anyway, phase 2 of our touchdown procedure is to lower our ramp up to the rover garage to, line up with the ground. Couldn't do that with action groups, really, because it has to be a very specific angle based on the surface that you've landed on. And then we can get our engineer Kerbal out to remove the struts that are keeping the surface scanner and communications pole locked in place. I originally had those without the struts, but they just sort of flopped about a bit during launch and caused the whole thing to become a bit imbalanced. So I strutted them in place because we now, of course, have the luxury of being able to remove struts once you've launched the vessel using an engineer Kerbal. So at the very least, make sure you've brought an engineer with you. Probably should have said that earlier on before I started advertising this craft. Anyway, as you can see, we have now deployed everything. We've got the solar panels out. We've got the aerials deployed. It's very overkill, that communications tower, isn't it? We only really need the satellite dish component, but I like the little look of having those smaller red and white antenna just below it. Makes it look a bit more, I don't know, science fiction-y, I guess. We've also deployed the drill, and the surface scanner is now spinning. One thing I want to do now is quickly make sure that our rover can indeed embark and disembark the garage. When you're on a slant like this, you want to try and take steps to make sure that the rover has to go up as shallow of a slope as possible. So one of the steps I took, as I mentioned earlier, was rotated to the base once it had landed to make sure that the actual ramp faced the uphill, so that it'd be easy for our rover to pick up speed approaching the ramp, and then the actual angle of inclination for the ramp could be as low as possible. If it were facing the downhill, then it would have to be oriented in a much more vertical position, which might have meant that the rover would have been able to climb up. Now, this is mainly a Tylo and Eve and Kerbin problem. On bodies with lower surface gravity, it's less of an issue, I would assume. I haven't tested this anywhere other than Kerbin and Tylo. Probably should have, but again, that's why I'm calling upon the community to test this base out and make any suggestions for improvements and what have you from the in the forum post, the link to which again is in the description. And hey, whilst you're down there, make sure you give this video a little like if you're enjoying it. It really helps the channel out. And I probably should have said this way earlier if my audience retention analytics or anything to go by. Most of you have left by now, but it would be a shame if people had left by now, because they would have missed our EVA and, more crucially, our flag plant, which is happening now and is of course the most important part of any surface activity, and indeed any crewed Kerbal mission really. Well, actually, before we plant the flag, we're doing a quick lap around the base to get a good survey of it. And there we are, the LowneAerospace insignia emblazoned on the surface of Tylo. Well, I guess it's emblazoned on the flag, which is then stuck into the surface of Tylo, but you get the point. And now we've got 2 Kerbals out on EVA. It's time to test the rover. Yes, it's not just a robotic probe with wheels. It has seats, so Kerbals can sit on it and they can drive places. So that's what we're going to do. So we're just going to awkwardly roll the rover down to the surface of Tylo, put the brakes on, and then we can get our Kerbals onto the rover. Now, it's very important that you disable the SAS wheel where the docking port is. The reason that SAS wheel is there is because if the rover flips over, you can just right-click the reaction wheel, press toggle torque or activate wheel. I can't remember what the exact command is, but activate it basically. And then the rover has enough SAS power to flip itself back over without needing, like a fancy landing leg or robot arm solution to reorient itself. And yes, that even works on bodies with surface gravity as high as places like Eve and Tylo. So that's why that reaction wheel is there. It's not actually needed for most of the rover's functionality. So we're only going for a little quick drive just here, just to test out the rover, make sure it's stable, which on somewhere with surface gravity as high as Tylo, it's not a very difficult thing to do, to design a rover that's stable. If you're on somewhere like Minmus or, heaven forbid, Gilly, try and drive slowly. I mean, with Gilly, I would just leave. I wouldn't bother landing this thing on Gilly, to be honest. You'd have a hard time landing on Gilly with this, or with anything really, as experience has taught me. Now we can just get the rover back into the surface space. And I think I went off and did something, because now the lighting has suddenly changed. I'm pretty sure the door went or something and I had to pick up a delivery. Not sure why the lighting suddenly changed. Anyway, we could just shuffle this back into the surface space, which was pretty easy. And then we can close the door because it just feels better. I think it's quite cool. It's quite cool to have a closable door like that. I bound it to a specific action group and everything. Not that we really need it all on somewhere like Tylo, but again, this is a base for all places, and places like Juna, Lathe, Eve, they might have storms, or like you might park it near a cryovolcano on Val, and you want some protection from the elements for the rover. But it's mainly because it looks very cool. Anyway, we're going to now set up our surface, I was going to say our surface base, but our surface experiments and solar panels and stuff. I actually forgot to pack a communication dish, so all of this is pretty useless, but it's all for show anyway, right, guys? I mean, surface bases in general are pointless. You're not launching them for, the practicality of them. You're launching them because they're cool, I guess. At least ones of this scale. I know you can build practical ones that are literally just a science lab and the science experiments, and that's it. This ain't that. And guys, has anyone managed to place the tall lights anywhere? Every time I've tried to place that, it's just fallen over. It's way too top heavy. Squad, I know that you know that I exist, so hopefully one of you maybe is watching this video and please, can we have that light lower its center of gravity or something, because it just falls over. And I know it's not just a Tylo issue. I tried placing it on Elu and it fell over all the time. Unfortunately, there aren't many places in Kerbal Space Program that are completely flat, and it's a tripod, so it should be able to tolerate standing on the surfaces. I own tripods and I've placed them on slopes steeper than this slope. The issue is that the Kerbals just drop it from like a foot above the ground, and then it just bounces and falls over. So maybe can we have the Kerbals place it like a flag, where they actually hold it and place it rather than just drop it? Dunno. That'd be nice. Anyway, on that sort of ranty end note, there is the surface base. It's finished. And there is an end screen to other videos that I have made. Joy, hopefully, maybe. You can also buy my merch and follow me on Twitter and follow me on Instagram and, join my Discord and stuff from links in the description. And you can check out my Patreon as well if you want to support me monetarily. That's always appreciated. I don't think there's any need for me to carry on talking. Goodbye.